Chandrila, Heart of the Core, A Galactic Legacy. Chapter 1. A Jewel Among the Stars, Geography and Origins. In the heart of the galaxy, nestled along the luminous arterial lanes of the core worlds, lies a planet whose name echoes with reverence in the annals of galactic civilization, Chandrila. Orbiting a bright, stable G-type star, the planet rests within a stable, wealthy region of the galactic disk, far from the political turbulence and lawlessness of the outer rim. Its position grants it more than proximity to power. It gives it cultural influence, trade leverage, and a seat at nearly every major galactic negotiation table for over 25,000 years. A verdant sphere marked by deep emerald greens and serene azure blues, Chandrila presents a harmony between nature and civilization unlike any other core planet, eschewing the excess and industry of Coruscant for a landscape that reflects its people's values, balance, beauty, and mindfulness. Geographically, Chandrila is a wonder of planetary formation, graced with two massive, nearly symmetrical continents that spiral gently along its equatorial band like a mirrored pair. These twin landmasses, Orlean and Virijancy, stretch from pole to pole, cradling the planet's extensive oceans and inland seas between them. The result is a rich biome where rolling green hills extend for kilometers without interruption, and crystalline lakes reflect the twin moons in perfect clarity. Chandrila's climate is temperate and mild, a planetary gift that has nurtured agricultural stability since its earliest days of settlement. Fields of native muja fruit trees, windswept grain terraces, and amber-colored Kelvara flower plains dominate the rural landscapes, while deep freshwater lakes, such as Lake Saho and the sacred Mirror Bay, anchor local settlements with natural beauty and spiritual significance. What sets Chandrila apart from its core world neighbors is not just its natural splendor, but its architectural philosophy. Rather than building upwards into the skies or excavating deep into the planet's crust, the Chandrilan people embrace the concept of arcology, blending architecture with ecology. Their cities do not impose upon the land, but rather flow with it. Hills are crowned with homes constructed from biodegradable composites that mirror the curves of the land, and entire neighborhoods are built into the sides of cliffs or beneath the canopies of centuries-old trees. Transportation systems favor maglev gliders and gravity trains that float silently through the countryside, powered by sustainable geothermal energy drawn from beneath the planet's mantle. Towering arcologies, often grown with bioengineered materials rather than built with steel and stone, house entire urban centers within domed ecosystems, preserving external nature while creating internal harmony. Though Chandrila today stands as a paragon of progressive governance and environmental stewardship, its story begins in the murky folds of galactic prehistory. Colonized in the early days of Old Republic expansion, the planet was first settled by human pioneers tracing the hyperspace currents of the Corellian Run. These settlers, fleeing the congestion and oligarchic dominance of Coruscant and Alsacan, were drawn to Chandrila's promise: fertile lands, open skies, and room to shape a society from the soil up. Early Chandrilan colonies took root along the shores of the Nevely River and the Great Western Sea known as Brenter's Deep, places where fresh water, mineral resources, and mild weather enabled long-term habitation. From these coastal footholds, Chandrila's society emerged with startling speed. By the time of the Galactic Republic's formal charter, Chandrila had already established its planetary government, a council of voice keepers, an early form of deliberative democracy where leaders were chosen not for wealth or military strength, but for eloquence, reason, and commitment to public welfare. It was one of the few early colony worlds to reject hereditary governance, aristocracy, and centralized executive power outright. These choices, embedded in Chandrilan culture, would become its ideological hallmark: pacifism, civil discourse, and decentralization of authority. This early identity was shaped by necessity as much as idealism. The planet's low population density and minimal natural defenses made it vulnerable, and cooperation was more than a virtue, it was survival. Over time, several major settlements rose to prominence across the two continents. Among them, the most enduring and influential was Hana City, established near the confluence of the Irash River and Mirror Bay on the eastern side of Virijancy. Originally a quiet agricultural commune, Hana City grew into the planetary capital through its proximity to mineral-rich hills and hyperspace beacon stations. Despite its growth, Hana City retained the simplicity of Chandrilan design. There were no skyscrapers piercing the clouds, no sprawling factories churning smoke. Instead, The city evolved as a network of interconnected dome structures, green walkways, and public amphitheaters, where citizens could engage in civic debate under the open sky. Its central legislative chamber, the Dome of Harmony, became a planetary symbol of open governance, a half-spherical complex surrounded by tranquil gardens and clear water moats, designed to foster contemplation and public accessibility. Beyond Hana City, other settlements flourished in their own unique ways. Nema Plain became a hub for agricultural innovation, where genetically engineered crops were tested for planetary sustainability. Saho Reach, nestled beside Lake Saho, evolved into an educational and cultural district, home to the prestigious Chandrila Institute for Democratic Studies. Port Adjan, located on the western coast of Orleans, served as the primary spaceport and trade terminus for off-world visitors, its design blending space traffic control with Chandrilan botanical artistry. Yet even these urban areas retained a low footprint, with laws forbidding unchecked urban sprawl and mandating green space to be equal in size to any developed zone. Economically and politically, Chandrila's location proved vital to its prominence. The Corellian Run, a major hyperspace corridor stretching from Coruscant to the Outer Rim, passed directly through Chandrilan space. This route, one of the galaxy's oldest and safest hyperlanes, linked Chandrila with critical trade hubs such as Corellia, Duro, and the Taiyan Cluster. This positioning turned the planet into a natural nexus of interstellar commerce and diplomacy. Its spaceports handled traffic from trade barges to diplomatic shuttles, and its orbital customs stations became known for their efficiency and fairness. While Chandrila never pursued the industrial might of Quat or the shipbuilding empires of Fonder, it developed a robust export economy centered on high-quality agricultural goods, artisanal wares, and democratic advisory services, often sending civic architects and bureaucratic mentors to help stabilize new planetary governments. But trade routes brought more than cargo. They brought culture, conflict, and influence. Chandrila's proximity to Coruscant meant that its voice in the Galactic Senate was not only heard, but often amplified. Its senators regularly found themselves in the orbit of major galactic decisions, their votes weighted not just by law but by reputation. Yet even when surrounded by the grandeur and corruption of Coruscant, Chandrilan representatives carried their world's ethos like a banner. They eschewed opulent robes for modest garments of woven green fiber, symbolizing their agrarian heritage. They chose discourse over decree, and were often the last voices calling for diplomacy when other worlds prepared for war. Despite these ideals, Chandrila was not immune to the darker currents of history. Its early pacifism made it vulnerable to pirate raiders and political manipulation during the expansionist wars of the Taiwanese and the early Mandalorian incursions. However, rather than militarize, Chandrila invested in regional alliances, defense pacts, and neutral arbitration. It cultivated a reputation as a world where warring parties could meet without fear of subterfuge or sabotage. This gave rise to a diplomatic tradition that spanned millennia, culminating in the planet's future role as the capital of the new republic, a symbolic seat of power chosen not for might, but for moral clarity. Thus, from twin continents and the gentle rhythm of seasons to the corridors of galactic policy, Chandrila emerged as more than a core world. It became a core ideal. It stood not only as a place of green hills and crystal lakes, but as a living argument for a different kind of civilization, one where power rested in peace, and governance grew not from conquest, but from consensus. Its geography may have placed it near the center of the galaxy, but its soul placed it at the heart of the Republic's conscience. And as the galaxy grew more fractious and power more brittle, Chandrila's enduring message of harmony would shine brighter against the stars that surrounded it. Chapter 2: Seeds of Democracy, Chandrila and the Old Republic. Long before the rise and fall of empires, before the Clone Wars and the shadows of Sith machinations, Chandrila stood as one of the ideological bedrocks of the Galactic Republic. When the foundation stones of galactic unity were first laid, Chandrila's voice resonated not with the call to arms or promises of power, but with quiet conviction, reasoned debate, and an unwavering belief in the right of every world to determine its destiny. While other core worlds aligned themselves with oligarchs or military guilds, Chandrila chose a different path, one rooted in pacifism, diplomacy, and self-governance. It was a philosophy not merely spoken in the grand chambers of politics, but lived in the fields, classrooms, and common assemblies across the planet. For Chandrilans, democracy was not an ideal to be studied. It was a birthright to be practiced, defended, and refined over generations. This deep-seated political identity emerged from the planet's earliest days. The initial settlers, who arrived via the Corellian Run, were not nobles sent to oversee a resource world, nor mercenaries hired to establish a frontier outpost. They were philosophers, farmers, educators, and idealists. They saw in Chandrila's rolling plains and wide-open skies a blank canvas upon which to paint a new model of society, one without monarchs, without standing armies, without the rigid castes and hierarchies that plagued so many of the older core worlds. With communal farming cooperatives, shared civic forums, and a system of rotating leadership roles chosen by merit and speech rather than birth or wealth, these pioneers laid the foundation for what would become one of the most progressive political cultures in the galaxy. The emphasis on civil liberty was not reactionary, but anticipatory. They believed tyranny began in small compromises and took root in apathy, so vigilance, education, and public accountability became cultural mandates. By the time of the formation of the Galactic Republic over 25 millennia before the Battle of Yavin, Chandrila had already developed a planetary government unlike any of its neighbors. Where Coruscant's politics were mired in bureaucratic layers and Corellia's power was centered in ancient dynasties, Chandrila had implemented a model based on consensus councils, citizen participation, and term-limited representatives. This made it a natural ally in the initial push for a republic grounded in cooperation rather than conquest. Chandrila was not merely present at the republic's founding, it was instrumental in shaping its earliest doctrines. The planet's emissaries were among the loudest voices calling for a senate that represented all member systems, regardless of wealth or military strength. Their arguments helped solidify the idea of planetary sovereignty within a unified legislative framework, ensuring that even the smallest world could have a voice in galactic affairs. Among the earliest senators to represent Chandrila was Dorn Hestrel, a revered statesman whose transcripts survive in partial form within the great archives of Coruscant. Hestrel, known for his long pauses and devastatingly precise rhetoric, earned the nickname the Thoughtful Blade for the way he wielded logic and compassion to cut through political obstruction. He famously opposed early attempts to centralize military control under Coruscant's command, warning that any army raised in the name of peace would eventually serve the cause of domination. His opposition to the early security coordination accords set the tone for Chandrilan diplomacy in the millennia that followed. Support for peacekeeping, yes, but never at the expense of local autonomy or civilian oversight. Hestrel's speeches on nonviolent arbitration became required reading at the Chandrila Institute of Civic Ethics centuries later, and fragments of his writings would be quoted by Mon Mothma during her own resistance to Palpatine's authoritarian rise. The planetary governance model that supported figures like Hestrel was as unique as it was effective. At its heart stood the Chandrilan Council, a rotating body of citizen legislators drawn from across the planet's communes, cities, and educational institutions. Service on the council was considered both a civic duty and a rite of passage. Citizens were encouraged from a young age to engage in public discourse, attend open debates, and even draft policy proposals. This emphasis on political education ensured that by the time someone was selected for council service, either through local vote or a merit-based examination, they were already steeped in the ethical traditions and procedural expectations of Chandrilan governance. Each council term lasted only 4 standard years, and no individual was permitted to serve more than 2 non-consecutive terms in their lifetime. This prevented the entrenchment of political dynasties and encouraged a continual influx of new ideas and generational perspectives. What made this model even more remarkable was its decentralized nature. The Planetary Council never sought to micromanage Chandrila's cities or townships. Instead, it functioned more as a steward of planetary values and an arbiter between local regions. Governance at the commune or district level was highly autonomous, tailored to the needs of each region, whether the academic policies of Sao-Ti Reach or the agricultural logistics of Nima Plain. This diversity of governance structures under a unifying ethical code created a kind of dynamic pluralism. It allowed Chandrila to adapt to the demands of time without betraying its foundational beliefs. The Council's primary mandate was to ensure adherence to the Chandrilan Charter, a living document that enshrined freedom of expression, the right to education, environmental preservation, and the prohibition of armed conflict as a tool of internal policy. These principles made Chandrila an anomaly in the galaxy, a system stable not because of enforcement, but because of shared cultural conviction. This devotion to local governance and civilian oversight did not always sit well with the broader trends of galactic politics. As the Republic expanded and worlds clamored for standardized law enforcement, trade regulations, and security guarantees, Chandrila often found itself in the minority. It voted against the Republic Judicial Reorganization Act, warning that too much central control over planetary courts would erode local traditions. It resisted the military consolidation efforts that followed the pious DEA crusades, arguing that even well-intentioned militarism could become tyrannical. In one of the most controversial moments of early Republic history, Chandrila spearheaded the opposition to the Temple Oversight Act, which would have given Jedi a permanent seat on every planetary government. While the world held deep respect for the Jedi Order, it believed even noble institutions should not rule without accountability. For Chandrila, power was a responsibility too heavy to be left unexamined, even when carried by those with the best intentions. Over the centuries, this political philosophy often placed Chandrila at odds with more authoritarian trends in the core. During the Alsacan conflicts, Chandrila refused to take sides in the militarized disputes between Coruscant and Alsacan over trade route dominance. Instead, it hosted secret peace summits, offering neutral ground to mediate tensions. While many other worlds viewed this neutrality as naivete, Chandrila's quiet influence grew. It became the galaxy's moral compass, a planet whose opinions might not sway fleets but could sway hearts. Diplomats trained on Chandrila were frequently called upon to mediate treaties, settle disputes between rival guilds, and draft charters for new colony worlds. Its universities exported not just knowledge, but a model of engaged citizenship and moral reasoning that found root across the galaxy, from the colonies of the expansion region to the judicial courts of the Inner Rim. Yet for all its restraint, Chandrila was not passive. When the Republic faced existential threats, notably during the Great Hyperspace War and the Sictas uprisings, Chandrila contributed not troops but strategies, logistics, and emergency aid. It sent fleets of hospital ships, coordinated refugee relocation, and funded food relief across dozens of systems. Its philosophy of peace did not mean retreat. It meant that solutions should heal rather than harm. Even its intelligence services, though limited in number, became renowned for their focus on conflict prevention, using diplomacy, economic leverage, and cultural outreach to disarm tensions before they ignited into open war. In this way, Chandrila's commitment to pacifism was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength, one that refused to meet violence with greater violence, but instead sought to make violence unnecessary. In the grand architecture of the Galactic Republic, where trillions of voices vied for influence and countless systems sought advantage, Chandrila remained a steady, principled presence. It never held the most votes, commanded the greatest wealth, or built the largest ships, but it shaped the moral framework of the Republic in ways that endured far longer than any fleet or fortune. It was a voice of reason in chaos, a builder of bridges in times of division, and a reminder that in a galaxy so often torn by ambition, there was still room for idealism, so long as it was practiced with vigilance, courage, and humility. As the Republic evolved and the galaxy grew more complex, Chandrila's role would be tested. Yet even amid shifting alliances, rising threats, and the creeping shadow of authoritarianism, the seeds planted in those early days, seeds of democracy, of conscience, of collective responsibility, would take root across countless worlds. And when darkness finally descended in the form of the Empire, it would be Chandrila's descendants, its ideals, and its legacy that lit the spark of rebellion. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, in the quiet councils of its people and the measured speeches of its senators, Chandrila had already shaped the Republic, not through force, but through the enduring power of principle. Chapter 3: Cultural Identity, Art, Education, and Way of Life. To understand Chandrila is to recognize that its political ideals are not isolated institutions. They are lived experiences, woven into the very rhythm of daily life and manifest in art, architecture, education, and ritual. On Chandrila, democracy is not confined to voting booths or Senate chambers. It echoes through the voices of poets, the brushstrokes of landscape painters, the silent elegance of hillside dwellings, and the debates held at open-air forums by students barely past adolescence. The cultural identity of this verdant core world is an inseparable fusion of intellect and aesthetic, community, and self-expression. There exists a quiet reverence for the natural world and for the social fabric that binds one being to another, not out of obligation, but from a deeply internalized philosophy that civilization must nurture the soul as much as it manages law and commerce. At the heart of this cultural ecosystem lies Chandrila's long-standing devotion to philosophy and public discourse. The Chandrilans view open debate not as a means to an end, but as a vital element of personal and societal health. From an early age, children are taught to speak with clarity, listen with empathy, and question authority with respect. Debate forums are fixtures in every commune, and it is not uncommon to find lively yet civil discussions occurring during shared meals, on transit gliders, or in the reflective serenity of lakeside amphitheaters. This emphasis on articulation and reasoning is not only a civic tradition, it is a rite of intellectual passage. Ideas are not imposed from above but grown through dialogue, challenged in public view, and reshaped by the collective reasoning of a society committed to mutual understanding. The result is a culture where silence in the face of injustice is frowned upon, and where speaking one's truth, so long as it is done with thought and sincerity, is a celebrated act. Nowhere is this more evident than in Chandrila's storied institutions of learning. The planet boasts one of the oldest academic cultures in the galaxy, rivaling even the great intellectual legacies of Alderaan. At the heart of this rivalry lies the Chandrila Institute of Democratic Studies, an expansive campus nestled within the flowering terraces of Saoti Reach. Founded nearly 25,000 years ago, the institute has educated generations of senators, mediators, diplomats, and historians. Its libraries contain rare pre-Republic manuscripts and modern treatises on political ethics, while its lecture halls resound with the voices of thinkers engaged in the ceaseless evolution of social theory. Across the sea, in the cool hills of Nima Plain, lies the Conservatory of Civic Art, a university focused on the intersection of art, ethics, and public life. Here, sculpture gardens and reflective pools host students sculpting philosophical allegory into stone, or musicians composing symphonies inspired by political events. Chandrila's institutions do not merely teach facts, they cultivate minds that question, interpret, and synthesize. This educational tradition has fostered a long-standing academic rivalry with Alderaan, another bastion of high culture and civic virtue. Though the two worlds often agreed ideologically, their intellectual debates were passionate and precise. Alderaan favored structured elegance, rational idealism, and the legacy of monarchy fused with reformist policy. Chandrila, by contrast, championed egalitarianism, organic intellectualism, and the decentralization of knowledge. Student competitions, known as the oratory exchanges, were held every 4 years, drawing thousands from across the core. These events were less about victory and more about the celebration of reasoned dissent. Ironically, this rivalry brought the two cultures closer, shaping not just Chandrila's pedagogical evolution, but strengthening the very intellectual foundation of the Republic. Such values are physically embodied in Chandrila's architecture. The planet's buildings do not dominate their environment, they breathe with it. Structures curve with the land, built from locally sourced, biodegradable composites and living materials that age gracefully into the hillsides. Roofs are often planted with native mosses and flowering vines to support pollinators, while windows are designed to maximize natural light without compromising insulation. Urban centers like Hana City use layered walkways, green roofs, and subterranean forums to preserve the visual integrity of the natural landscape. Dwellings blend earth tones with sweeping organic lines, mimicking river stones or tree roots rather than synthetic symmetry. Chandrila's architects are known more for what they leave untouched than for what they construct. Every structure is a conversation with the environment rather than an imposition upon it. This philosophy extends even to public infrastructure. Power conduits are buried beneath flower meadows, waste reclamation facilities are housed within botanical sanctuaries, and high-speed transit hubs resemble groves more than terminals. Chandrila has proven, over millennia, that technological advancement need not come at the cost of natural beauty. Chandrilan culture finds its most exuberant expression in its festivals and seasonal traditions, rituals grounded in agricultural rhythms and symbolic of the planet's harmonious relationship with nature. One of the most revered is the Sealnik bloom, held during the first full moon of the new cycle, when the night-blooming Kelvara fields erupt in waves of bioluminescent color. Families and travelers gather across the hilltops, painting their faces with Kelvara dye and sharing stories by moonlight. Songs composed centuries ago are sung anew with each generation. and it is customary for young couples to exchange vows beneath the glowing blossoms. The harvest peace, celebrated at the end of the growing season, honors both the labor of the farmer and the patience of the land. Entire communes host open tables where food is freely shared, and disputes, both personal and political, are formally set aside for a day of unity. These festivals are not religious in the traditional sense, but they are deeply spiritual. They reinforce the Chandrilan belief that community is sustained not through decree, but through shared experience and mutual gratitude. Native flora and fauna are treated not as resources, but as cohabitants. The great sky herders of Lake Saoti are protected by planetary law, their migratory patterns influencing construction zoning and festival calendars. The silverfin birds of Mirror Bay are honored in art and music, their mating dances seen as metaphors for courtship and diplomacy. Even the smallest organisms, soil insects known as shimmerbugs, are the subject of children's stories and ecological research, celebrated for their role in composting and soil health. Students at Chandrilan schools are often assigned flora companions, plant species they study, care for, and present as part of a rite of passage ritual that combines biology with moral stewardship. This intimate familiarity with the natural world permeates every aspect of Chandrilan life, embedding conservation into the cultural psyche not as policy, but as identity. Underlying all of this, the discourse, the education, the harmony with nature, is Chandrila's fierce commitment to personal freedom and civil liberty, a legacy of its Corward philosophical heritage. While Coruscant forged its identity through systems and scale, Chandrila honed its soul through principles. The right to speak freely, to dissent, to gather, to learn, to choose one's vocation or path, these were not privileges but the foundations of personhood. Chandrilan law protects freedom of expression to an almost radical degree, permitting even the most controversial opinions so long as they do not incite violence. Privacy is similarly enshrined, with surveillance technology heavily restricted outside of interstellar customs zones. Education is not only free, it is compulsory, not just as a legal requirement, but as a societal expectation. A citizen's failure to engage in public life is seen not as a private choice, but as a community wound, one that must be healed through inclusion, not coercion. This societal design, so delicate, so careful, does not pretend to be perfect, but it is introspective. Every generation reinterprets Chandrilan ethics through the lens of its own challenges, and public forums are held every 12 years to re-examine the planetary charter. These forums, open to all citizens, are marathon affairs that can stretch on for weeks. Transcripts are preserved in the Hall of Breath, an underground chamber carved into the roots of a 1,000-year-old tree at the center of Saoti Reach. There, etched in luminescent script upon living walls, the voices of generations speak to one another across time, challenging, supporting, evolving. No other core world possesses such a living archive of conscience. In all things, Chandrila seeks harmony, not perfection, not power. Its people are not defined by conquest or commerce, but by their commitment to the quiet disciplines of listening, building, and growing. While other worlds dazzled the galaxy with innovation and spectacle, Chandrila shaped it through constancy, restraint, and grace. Its way of life, forged in open fields and spoken in open forums, became not just a cultural blueprint, but a philosophical challenge to the rest of the galaxy. To live not by dominion, but by dignity. And in the centuries to come, as wars would rage and empires would fall, that challenge would remain steadfast and clear, like the morning mist rising from the Kelvara fields, whispering that there was always another way. Chapter 4, From Shadows to Light, The Clone Wars and Resistance. When the drums of war began echoing across the galaxy, Chandrila was one of the few core worlds that did not meet them with applause. In a time when fear crept into every Senate chamber and the gleaming halls of Coruscant reverberated with calls for unity through militarization, Chandrila stood firm in its commitment to principle over panic. As the Republic teetered on the brink of the largest conflict since the Great Sith Wars, the Military Creation Act was introduced as a desperate answer to separatist threats. Yet to Chandrilans, it was not merely legislation, it was a betrayal. A betrayal of everything the Republic claimed to stand for, a surrender of idealism to expedience, and a harbinger of authoritarianism cloaked in necessity. While many systems saw armies as protection, Chandrila saw them as a step towards centralized control, a concentration of power that too often twisted noble intentions into chains. Among the voices opposing the act was a young senator whose name would one day become synonymous with resistance itself. Mon Mothma. Still in the early stages of her career, she had been mentored by the elder Senator Tarsus Valorum and raised within a family steeped in Chandrilan ethics. Even then, her speeches possessed a gravity beyond her years. With clarity, she articulated what many in her homeworld feared but hesitated to voice: that in building armies to fight the separatists, the Republic was building the very machinery that would one day be turned inward. In a now famous address given before the full Senate, broadcast live and archived in the great civic libraries of Chandrila, she warned that fear, no matter how justified, must never be allowed to dictate policy. Her words stirred the hearts of her people, reaffirming Chandrila's path as a moral compass in an age increasingly seduced by the false promise of safety through strength. As the war unfolded, and the clones marched beneath the banners of the Republic, Chandrila found itself at odds with the Galactic tide. While it did not secede, it refused to participate in active military support beyond non-combat logistics. Its factories were not retooled for weapons. Its universities did not become recruitment centers. Instead, it sent mediators, aid workers, and medical teams, efforts often dismissed by hawkish senators but deeply appreciated in the war-torn Outer Rim. The Chandrila Council passed local ordinances reaffirming their anti-militarist stance and blocking Republic requisition orders that would have diverted critical planetary resources to the war effort. These moves made Chandrila a target for criticism and quiet surveillance, but the planet held firm, protected in part by its long-standing reputation and in part by the sheer weight of galactic distraction. But it was not merely political rhetoric that shaped Chandrila's role in the Clone Wars. As Chancellor Palpatine accrued emergency powers, first temporarily, then indefinitely, Chandrilans watched with rising alarm. What began as wartime necessity soon became a creeping expansion of executive authority, and even as battles raged far from its shores, Chandrila was becoming a battlefield of ideals. The tension between duty to the Republic and loyalty to its founding principles tore at the heart of Chandrilan society. There were those who believed continued cooperation was essential, that open resistance would only invite occupation or worse. But there were others, quiet, determined, and increasingly organized, who saw the path ahead with harrowing clarity. Underground resistance to Palpatine's powers did not begin with weapons or espionage. It began with information. At the Chandrila Institute of Democratic Studies, professors began compiling archives of legislation, comparing Republic edicts to their constitutional precedents. Students organized late-night discussion circles where encryption protocols were passed along with philosophical tracts. Small, private gatherings, cloaked in the language of cultural salons, became forums for resistance planning. These gatherings included artists, civil servants, retired senators, and even sympathetic off-worlders who had taken refuge on Chandrila. They understood that the fight ahead would be one not only of strength, but of truth, that history itself was being rewritten in real time, and someone had to preserve the original script. The covert dissent grew bolder with each passing month. Unmarked transmitters began broadcasting anonymized debates dissecting Palpatine's decrees. Student-run networks embedded steganographic counter-propaganda into academic journals and art exhibits. Songs sung during the Festival of Renewal included subtle lyric changes referencing the erosion of liberty, and resistance slogans were woven into tapestries hung in public amphitheaters. Even as surveillance increased and Republic intelligence agencies intensified their scrutiny, Chandrila's resistance wore the mask of civility. It was an insurgency of intellect and memory, not yet of weapons, and that made it all the more difficult to silence. Despite this resistance, there were limits to what could be done openly. The Chandrilan Security Force, historically a decentralized and lightly armed organization, found itself in an unenviable position. Its officers were trained more in mediation than enforcement, and now they were caught between upholding planetary law and adhering to imperial mandates. As Republic oversight grew more invasive, a schism began to form within the security ranks. Some officers resigned in protest, unwilling to enforce censorship or arrest citizens for speech. Others remained, forming quiet pacts with local leaders to delay or circumvent unpopular orders. In several cases, entire communes reported falsified census data or staged harmless accidental disruptions to prevent imperial officials from targeting known dissenters. These acts of quiet defiance became part of a broader effort to shield the populace from the worst excesses of growing authoritarianism. Public protests also erupted, though rarely in the form of riots or violent demonstrations. Instead, they took on the subtle yet unmistakable shape of collective withdrawal. During the passage of the Emergency Broadcast Directive, in which the Republic sought control over all planetary communications, tens of thousands of Chandrilans participated in the Great Silence, an organized day of quiet in which no public speech was made. Transit systems ran without announcements, lectures were canceled, forums stood empty, and markets operated in stillness. The message was clear: without free speech, Chandrila would not speak at all. This silent protest reverberated throughout the core and, while downplayed in official records, it forced Palpatine's advisors to reconsider the visibility of their control efforts. In the twilight of the Clone Wars, as Palpatine's grip tightened and the Jedi were betrayed in a single sweeping order, Chandrila braced for a darker age. The Jedi had long been respected among Chandrilans, particularly for their diplomatic work, and their sudden vilification only deepened the planet's unease. Though few Jedi had called Chandrila home, many had studied its institutions, walked its forests, and meditated in its glades. The purge struck like a cold wind, and in response, Chandrilan citizens held vigils in fields of luminescent Kelvara, lighting floating lanterns in memory of those lost. It was not defiance, but it was not submission either. It was a public mourning of truth, a refusal to let the narrative of fear become the only story told. As the Republic was reborn as an empire, Chandrila stood at a precipice. The Senate still existed, hollow though it was, and Mon Mothma remained a member, her voice quieter, her expressions more measured, but her fire unquenched. Her speeches became less frequent but more pointed, peppered with coded language that only her fellow Chandrilans and a growing network of galactic dissenters could fully decipher. Behind her, the resistance deepened. Secret networks began to connect with like-minded operatives on Corellia, Alderaan, and even scattered cells in the Outer Rim. Data couriers were trained using traditional hiking routes in Chandrila's western canyons, their memory implants carrying encrypted manifests across hyperspace lanes under the guise of academic exchange. And yet, even as resistance grew, Chandrila never abandoned its values. It did not become a world of warlords or terror cells. It remained what it had always been, a sanctuary for thought, a beacon of principle, a society rooted in the belief that the highest form of power is found not in domination, but in dignity. Its people adapted not by compromising their ethics, but by finding new ways to live them. They taught their children the history of the Republic, not the one approved by imperial doctrine, but the one preserved in secret archives and whispered in lullabies. They continued to farm, to study, to build, and to love, not because they ignored the darkness, but because they refused to let it define them. The shadow of the Clone Wars passed, but it left scars not just of loss and betrayal, but of endurance. Chandrila had faced the abyss and held on to itself. It had not stopped the rise of tyranny, but it had planted seeds of resistance that would one day blossom across the stars. In the years to come, it would become the heart of the rebellion, the first capital of the new Republic, and the birthplace of a new galactic vision. But that future was still unwritten. In the moment, all that mattered was the quiet strength of a world that had refused to break, and the people who believed that even in the darkest night, the light of conscience could still burn bright. Chapter 5: Birthplace of Rebellion, Chandrila's Covert Role. When the Empire was proclaimed in the ruins of the Republic, it was not forged in open conquest, but in the slow corrosion of trust and truth. The galaxy, wearied by war and pacified by order, surrendered its liberty not in screams, but in silence. Worlds across the core watched with a mixture of apprehension and relief as the Senate bowed to the iron will of Palpatine, and the clone armies that once defended freedom became the enforcers of imperial stability. Yet on Chandrila, beneath the calm hills and quiet lakes, something ancient stirred, an enduring spark that refused to extinguish. While others mourned what was lost, Chandrila began to prepare. Not in bluster or bravado, but in whispers, in coded verse, and in the long, patient planning of those who knew that tyranny, no matter how total, was never eternal. The foundations of rebellion were laid not in a single moment, but in countless small acts of defiance, many of which were born in the shadowed corners of Chandrila's communes, forums, and arcologies. The formation of the Alliance to restore the Republic did not spring fully formed from one mind, nor did it begin in a formal declaration. It began in fragments, in data slivers carried by runners beneath starlit fields, in quiet conversations held beneath sculpture gardens, and in cryptic communiques shared between former senators, professors, farmers, and idealists who remembered a time when the Republic's ideals had meant something. Chandrila, long seen as a world of peace, had become a world of preparation. Beneath its reputation for restraint and moderation, it harbored an unshakable will to resist. Mon Mothma, still serving in the increasingly hollow Senate, became the most public face of this rising current. Her speeches, while more guarded than before, continued to thread moral critique through the veneer of compliance. But behind the scenes, her role was anything but passive. Operating from her family's ancestral estate near the coast of Lake Saoti, she convened clandestine gatherings of planetary governors, loyalist senators, and disillusioned military officers. These meetings were conducted under the guise of commemorative events, with guest lists scrubbed and travel permits rerouted to mislead imperial censors. The estate itself, an ancient structure partially built into a seaside cliff, was retrofitted with encrypted comm relays and emergency escape tunnels, developments overseen not by outsiders, but by local artisans and engineers loyal to the cause. There, within rooms lined with portraits of Chandrilan pacifists and poets, the seeds of open rebellion were sown. But it was not only Mothma who worked in the shadows. Chandrilan diplomats, long regarded as the Republic's most capable negotiators, were now repurposed as messengers, intelligence gatherers, and alliance builders. They moved through the galaxy under diplomatic immunity. Their shuttles scanned but rarely searched, their datapads encrypted with dual-layer coding that could hide an entire transmission beneath a harmless speech on agrarian policy. One such diplomat, Lyra Fosbar, used her trade mission to the Inner Rim as cover to establish contact with rebel sympathizers on Dantooine and Raltier, coordinating safe routes for defectors and embedding tracking viruses in Imperial supply chain manifests. Another, Solon Drooks, maintained a fictitious cultural exchange program with former Jedi worlds, using it as a mechanism to map surviving enclaves and recover fragments of Jedi archives before they were erased. The spy network that emerged from Chandrila was unlike any other in the galaxy. It was decentralized, cloaked in civility, and embedded in the very cultural infrastructure of the planet. Farmers who tended Kelvara fields near Nema Plain were known to plow coded symbols into their rows during high-altitude Imperial flyovers, messages only visible in the right light, with the right lens. University libraries housed book collections that had been slightly miscatalogued. Rebels using the old Chandrilan indexing system could find hidden compartments in certain stacks, each one containing microdata slivers with Alliance meeting locations or surveillance photos of stormtrooper deployment. Even household droids were programmed with dual operating layers, one for domestic service and another with encrypted rebel protocols triggered by spoken verse or biometric cue. Hana City, long a symbol of Chandrila's political heart, became a theater of silent rebellion. The Dome of Harmony, where civic assemblies once debated legislative policy, now hosted midnight strategy sessions disguised as symposium rehearsals. Architectural design meetings served as covers for security grid analysis. Anti-imperial graffiti appeared, then vanished, replaced by floral murals that contained hidden sigils readable only by those trained in ancient Chandrilan glyphs. At the city's core, beneath a seemingly mundane environmental research station, rebel technicians operated a communications hub codenamed Cinderglass, a name chosen for its dual symbolism, fragile transparency, and the potential for ignition. From this node, secure transmissions pulsed across the galactic web, bouncing through relay buoys disguised as weather satellites and hidden among trade data streams sent from Corellian commercial traffic. Cinderglass was one of the few places from which Mon Mothma herself could speak to distant rebel leaders without risk of interception. In the expanded universe's lesser-known corners, there are accounts of several Chandrilan rebel cells whose operations predated the formal declaration of rebellion by years. One such cell, known as the Kaelwyn Line, operated from the remote highlands of Orleans' western ridge. Composed of former agricultural guild leaders, rogue environmental scientists, and transport workers, the Kaelwyn Line specialized in mapping hyperspace microroutes used by unregistered courier ships. Their most significant contribution was the establishment of the Leafway, a complex trail of gravitational eddies and starfield shadows that enabled rebel vessels to move from the core to the mid-rim while avoiding most known Imperial checkpoints. Another cell, the Avenari Circle, worked within Chandrila's botanical research sector, cultivating plants that could resist atmospheric toxins and accelerate post-bombardment recovery, seeds meant for rebel worlds likely to suffer from Imperial reprisal. These operatives moved under the guise of ecological restoration, yet they were preparing the future landscapes of liberation. Despite its pacifist traditions, Chandrila did not shy away from acts of subversion. While it avoided open warfare on its soil, it trained rebel operatives in the arts of non-lethal sabotage, counter-surveillance, and infiltration. One of the planet's most revered institutions, the Saoti Conservatory, offered advanced training in dramatic performance and sensory manipulation, skills repurposed by rebel intelligence to create false personas, mislead imperial interrogators, and simulate entire personnel rosters using only a handful of skilled impersonators. The use of cultural tools as instruments of resistance became a Chandrilan specialty. Rebel performances staged in off-world refugee camps often contained hidden instructions in cadence and gesture, enabling local cells to coordinate actions without transmitting a single word. Perhaps most remarkable was the resilience of Chandrila's social fabric during this era of growing tension. The planet did not fracture under the pressure of rebellion, it adapted. Civilian communes began hosting memory walks, where groups would hike across ancestral routes while discussing encoded historical truths now forbidden in imperial schools. Families embedded subversive poetry into bedtime stories. Children learned both the official anthem of the Empire and a parallel anthem of the Fallen Republic, sung in alternate keys and carried across campfires on festival nights. Entire communities took part in resistance through ritual, through memory, through art. It was a rebellion not just of arms, but of identity. And yet, the risks were immense. Imperial scrutiny intensified with each cycle, and Chandrila's patience was often tested to its breaking point. Arrests were made, though rarely publicized. Data nodes were raided, transmitters destroyed. The secret police, though officially forbidden from operating on core worlds without senatorial oversight, found ways to infiltrate supply chains, social forums, and intercommunal gatherings. Some rebel operatives were forced off-world. Others disappeared without a trace. And still the rebellion grew. The breaking point came with Mon Mothma's now legendary declaration of open defiance against the Emperor, broadcast following the Gorman massacre. While her escape from Coruscant was aided by agents in multiple systems, the initial protocols for her extraction had been written years prior by Chandrilan strategists working under the designation Verdant Echo. The operation's success, smuggling her through bureaucratic cover identities past multiple hyperlane checkpoints and into the arms of the newly unified alliance, was testament to Chandrila's meticulous planning and unwavering commitment. From that moment forward, Chandrila was no longer a quiet participant. It was a keystone. With the formal emergence of the Rebel Alliance, Chandrila's role only deepened. It offered not military hardware, but something more potent: legitimacy, leadership, and moral clarity. As a founding member world, it became a beacon to other core worlds questioning the Emperor's growing madness. Its agricultural surplus helped feed rebel bases. Its diplomatic channels were used to negotiate safe harbor with neutral systems. And its people, so often viewed as reserved and moderate, became some of the most committed revolutionaries in the galaxy. Not because they had abandoned their values, but because they had upheld them when it was hardest to do so. In the years that followed, the galaxy would come to know the Rebel Alliance as a force of guerrilla fighters, bold generals, and daring pilots. But behind that fire was always the patient, enduring glow of worlds like Chandrila. Worlds that had resisted not with blasters, but with belief. Worlds that had hidden their secrets beneath Kelvara fields and in the folds of songs. Worlds that had prepared for the fall not with panic, but with purpose. And when the time came to rise, it was those worlds that gave the rebellion its soul. Chandrila, quiet and steadfast, had never needed to shout to change the galaxy. It only needed to endure, and in enduring, it became the birthplace of hope. Chapter 6: New Beginnings, Capital of the New Republic. In the wake of war and the fall of an empire, it was not military power or industrial might that guided the choice of the new republic's first capital. It was symbolism. When the fractured Rebel Alliance emerged victorious over the Galactic Empire and the tyrant who had ruled it from a throne of fear, the galaxy looked not merely for a center of governance, but for a moral foundation upon which to rebuild. Coruscant, though still the galactic hub of bureaucracy and commerce, was tainted, its skyline haunted by the ghosts of Senate purges, of Jedi betrayals, of surveillance towers and stormtrooper marches. Other worlds offered strength, wealth, or strategic position, but it was Chandrila, serene and principled, that offered something far rarer: credibility. The decision to designate Chandrila as the first capital of the new republic was not one of convenience, but of conviction. It stood as a message to the galaxy that the new era would not be shaped by conquest, but by conscience. Chandrila's selection carried a poetic resonance that rippled through every corner of the liberated galaxy. It was the world of Mon Mothma, the Alliance's civilian leader, and the voice that had dared defy the Emperor openly when others still cowered in silence. It was the world whose traditions of decentralization, pacifism, and civil liberty formed the very antithesis of imperial rule. In its fields had bloomed a culture of peace. In its lecture halls had flourished philosophies of governance. And in its arcologies and hilltop communes, generations had lived the ideals that the new republic now aspired to codify across thousands of systems. By making Chandrila its first capital, the fledgling republic sought to anchor its rebirth not in the grandeur of the old, but in the humility of a world that had never surrendered its soul. Hana City, long the seat of Chandrilan governance and a symbol of deliberative democracy, underwent a transformation that was both swift and symbolic. The Dome of Harmony, formerly used for planetary councils and cultural forums, was expanded with great care to accommodate the newly reformed Galactic Senate. Architects and civic planners from dozens of worlds contributed to the redesign, working within Chandrila's strict ecological and aesthetic guidelines. No towering bureaucratic monoliths rose here. Instead, the Senate's chamber was constructed beneath a living dome of bioluminescent flora, its translucent shell filtering starlight into soft radiance over a circular chamber arranged not by hierarchy, but by proximity, ensuring no single world could dominate through physical position. Transparent acoustic networks allowed every voice to be heard equally, and recordings of each session were archived in public databanks accessible to all Chandrilan citizens. This transparency, embedded into the architecture itself, was a statement of intent. The new republic would not hide behind steel or secrecy. Around the new Senate building, civic infrastructure blossomed like petals around a new bloom. Diplomatic housing was integrated into existing arcologies, foreign embassies were woven into the city's terraced gardens, and administrative departments were dispersed across Hana City in a deliberate attempt to decentralize power. Where the empire had centralized and concentrated, the new republic sought to distribute and dilute. Governance was no longer a monolith. It was a collaboration. And at the center of that collaboration stood Mon Mothma, appointed as the first chancellor of the new republic with near-unanimous support. Her leadership, tempered by years of resistance and the scars of war, was defined not by command, but by persuasion. She was not a ruler, she was a steward. One of her first and most defining acts was the introduction of sweeping disarmament legislation. The galaxy, long steeped in the rhythms of warfare, was asked to set down its weapons. The Military Disarmament Act, passed within the first year of the new republic's founding, dramatically reduced the size of the centralized republic fleet, redistributed military command to regional sectors, and allocated resources toward rebuilding planetary economies rather than maintaining martial force. Chandrila, consistent in its ideology, supported the act not only in legislation but through example, repurposing its own planetary defense grid into a planetary research and environmental monitoring network. Detractors argued that such measures left the Republic vulnerable to future threats. Proponents, including Mothma herself, countered that peace without demilitarization was merely a pause between wars. The debate that followed was one of the most passionate in the new Republic's early history, and it exposed the underlying tension between idealism and pragmatism that would come to define the era. Chandrila also became a crucible for transitional justice. With the empire defeated but not entirely dismantled, questions loomed large. What should be done with former Imperials? Should they be punished, rehabilitated, or allowed to fade into civilian life? In response, Mothma convened the Transitional Ethics Forum, hosted within the Sao-Ti Conservatory, where philosophers, legal scholars, survivors, and even former Imperial officers gathered to debate the nature of justice in a post-authoritarian age. The outcome of these forums was the Chandrila Accords, a sweeping policy framework that outlined the Republic's approach to reconciliation, justice, and civil rights. The Accords established independent truth tribunals, created protections for Imperial defectors who assisted the rebellion, and laid the groundwork for the restoration of free press and education on formerly occupied worlds. While not without controversy, the Accords became a cornerstone of New Republic policy and an enduring symbol of Chandrila's influence on galactic ethics. Yet not all was harmonious. The early years of the New Republic were marked by friction and fragility. In the expanded universe, records from the Hannah Journals, a series of personal writings kept by various senators and aides during the early sessions, reveal that not all worlds were content with Chandrila's cultural dominance. Some accused the world of moral elitism, of projecting its ideals without understanding the harsh realities of the Outer Rim or the needs of industrialized systems rebuilding from devastation. Others challenged the practicality of demilitarization, pointing to resurgent warlords, pirate factions, and the lingering threat of imperial holdouts. These criticisms were not unfounded. While Chandrila offered vision, it sometimes lacked the strategic infrastructure to implement that vision quickly or uniformly. Power vacuums developed. Some planetary governors, once emboldened by the fall of the Empire, became petty tyrants in their own right. The Republic, in its desire to avoid central control, at times found itself unable to respond swiftly to crises. These challenges sparked heated debates within the Senate chamber, and despite Mothma's best efforts, fissures emerged within the coalition. Legislation became increasingly complex as the Republic expanded its reach. Chandrila championed bills focused on refugee resettlement, planetary environmental restoration, and educational equity. But these often clashed with initiatives from Corellia, Quat, and other trade-heavy systems, whose representatives argued for economic recovery and galactic reintegration. In one notable clash, the Rebuilding Sovereignty Act, proposed by a Chandrilan delegation, was met with fierce resistance by Rimworld senators who believed it imposed undue regulation on planetary economies. The debate lasted 3 weeks and nearly collapsed a key budget initiative, forcing Mothma to broker a compromise that limited the act's scope. These moments, though difficult, revealed the maturing nature of the Republic's new governance, a system no longer held together by fear or decree, but by deliberation and compromise, even in the face of dissent. Differences between canon and expanded universe accounts of this era provide further insight into Chandrila's evolving role. In the canonical timeline, Chandrila was only the temporary capital, eventually replaced as the Senate rotated between worlds, a decision intended to prevent the centralization of power that doomed the Republic before. However, in the expanded universe, Chandrila retained a longer-term influence, serving as the spiritual heart of the Republic even after formal institutions relocated. It continued to host key conferences, training academies, and judicial panels. Rebel veterans retired to its communes. War orphans were adopted into its families. Even after the capital moved, many of the Republic's guiding policies bore the unmistakable mark of Chandrilan philosophy. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Chandrila's time as capital was the cultural shift it inspired. On thousands of worlds, local governments began to adopt communal assemblies modeled on Chandrilan forums. Art installations in places as distant as Mon Kala and Ariadu depicted Kelvara fields and lantern vigils. Schools named their debating chambers after Mon Mothma, and recordings of Hannah City's early Senate sessions became study materials for civic institutions. Chandrila had not merely governed, it had inspired. Its ideas, exported not through fleets but through faith, became the blueprint for a galaxy trying to heal. And yet, Chandrila never sought permanence. Its own people understood that power, even well-intentioned, could become a trap. When the Senate later voted to begin rotating the capital among member worlds, Chandrila supported the decision wholeheartedly. It celebrated the move not as a loss, but as a fulfillment of its purpose. It had guided the Republic through its infancy. It had reminded the galaxy that democracy was not a place but a process. And now, with institutions stable and new leaders rising, it could return to what it had always been, a world of thought, of principle, of peace. The transition was marked by a ceremony, known as the Last Bloom, held at the edge of Mirror Bay beneath the twin moons. Thousands gathered to release glowing Kelvara lanterns into the sky, each bearing the name of a fallen rebel, a lost senator, a silenced voice. Mon Mothma, standing before the crowd with age upon her shoulders and light in her eyes, gave one final address as Chancellor. She spoke not of endings, but of beginnings, of a galaxy forever imperfect, but always worth striving for. Her words, like Chandrila itself, were quiet, resolute, and unforgettable. So ended the capital era of Chandrila, but its influence would echo through every decision made in its wake. The Chandrila Accords remained a guiding framework. Its model of governance was replicated in hundreds of systems, and its legacy, that peace is strongest when rooted in justice, that liberty requires vigilance, and that true leadership is service, endured long after the banners were lowered. Chandrila had led not by force, but by example. And in doing so, it had given the galaxy more than a capital. It had given it hope. Chapter 7: Legacy of Peace, Military, Diplomacy, and Disarmament. Throughout the violent fluctuations of galactic history, empires rising, republics falling, and wars fought on the crusts of shattered worlds, there remained a singular beacon of pacifist constancy in the core worlds, Chandrila. While others built fleets, raised armies, and treated conflict as an inevitable currency of politics, Chandrila remained doggedly, even defiantly, committed to the doctrine of defense through diplomacy. This was not naivete masquerading as virtue, but the accumulated wisdom of a culture that had studied war as pathology and sought, generation after generation, to inoculate itself against the allure of martial glory. Peace on Chandrila was not the absence of conflict. It was a daily discipline, a civic principle encoded into its laws, education, and philosophy. To defend one's world without a standing army, to resist tyranny without embracing violence, required more than idealism. It demanded an unshakable belief that civilization could resolve its greatest tensions through consensus and courage rather than through weapons and fear. This belief shaped Chandrila's role in every major galactic conflict, from the earliest expansion of the Republic to the days of the Empire and beyond. Unlike Corellia or Quat, Chandrila never pursued martial dominance. It had no starfighter academies, no large shipyards dedicated to battlecruisers or carriers. Its contribution to the Republic's war efforts over millennia was always modest in terms of material, but monumental in moral terms. When asked to send troops, it sent mediators. When asked to produce weapons, it offered humanitarian aid. When the Clone Wars erupted and militarization swept through the core, Chandrila stood among the few that voiced opposition to the Military Creation Act, even as the galaxy bristled with anticipation of battle. Later, when the Galactic Empire demanded planetary compliance and assistance with armament production, Chandrila refused, weathering sanctions and surveillance rather than compromise its long-held principles. These were not acts of passivity, they were acts of defiance. In the face of coercive force, Chandrila met the blaster with the word, the stormtrooper with the scholar, and occupation with endurance. Yet for all its reputation as a bastion of pacifism, Chandrila's history was not devoid of defense. Rather, it reimagined what defense could mean. Central to this was the idea that protection need not come from domination, but from diplomacy, education, and, where necessary, coordinated civil resistance. The Chandrilan peacekeeper guilds were an embodiment of this philosophy, a network of citizen volunteers trained not in traditional combat, but in de-escalation, conflict resolution, and emergency coordination. These guilds were founded during the Alsacan conflicts, when neutral worlds found themselves caught in the crossfire of rival core alliances. Chandrila, refusing to militarize, established local peacekeeping chapters in every commune, composed of educators, engineers, doctors, and communication experts who could mobilize rapidly in times of unrest. These guilds operated under strict codes that forbade lethal force. Instead, they utilized non-lethal deterrence, shield technologies, localized atmospheric disruption tools, and crowd psychology techniques to protect civilian populations and maintain public order without escalating violence. The peacekeeper guilds trained in open fields, not behind closed walls. Their drills were part of communal festivals, reinforcing the idea that preparedness was a public virtue, not a private fear. They studied history, ethics, and crisis mediation as rigorously as they practiced field maneuvers. When the Empire eventually tightened its grip on core world governments, these guilds served as silent bulwarks of civil resilience. In the aftermath of Order 66, when the Jedi were hunted and the rule of law eroded, peacekeeper cells quietly sheltered fugitives, encoded messages in agricultural logs, and diverted local resources to feed displaced families. Some guild leaders were arrested or vanished entirely. Others melted back into civilian life, only to re-emerge during the rebellion as logistic officers, code runners, and community organizers. Though never formally acknowledged by the Rebel Alliance, the guild's contributions provided a model for how to resist oppression without embracing the tools of the oppressor. Throughout its history, Chandrila produced diplomats of unmatched skill, individuals who treated negotiation as both art and armor. One such figure was Bail Antilles, not to be confused with his Alderaanian namesake, Bail Organa, who served as a Chandrilan senator during the final century of the Old Republic. Antilles was a master orator and a fierce defender of planetary sovereignty. His speeches in the Senate often challenged centralized republic policies, particularly those that blurred the line between security and surveillance. He authored the Equilibrium Charter, a document that outlined planetary rights within the republic framework and which became a reference point for Chandrila's later resistance to imperial mandates. Though rarely remembered in mainstream galactic discourse, Antilles was revered on Chandrila as the quiet blade, a senator who wielded discourse with surgical precision. His legacy was carried forward by Mon Mothma and others who saw diplomacy not as a concession, but as the highest expression of civic strength. Another towering figure in Chandrila's diplomatic tradition was Talakai Selu, a former peacekeeper guild marshal turned planetary ethicist. Selu's theories on non-reactive guardianship became foundational to Chandrilan civil doctrine. He argued that the mere presence of military force changes the psychology of governance, that even benevolent power, when armed, distorts its own moral compass. Selu's writings, particularly The Radiance of Unarmed Integrity, were required reading in Chandrila's academic institutions and circulated among New Republic diplomats long after the Empire's fall. He trained multiple generations of civic leaders, many of whom went on to mediate interplanetary disputes across the Mid-Rim. Selu's influence extended even into Chandrila's architectural design, advocating for civic spaces that promoted dialogue, transparency, and vulnerability, structures without fortifications designed to welcome rather than repel. His death during the Imperial era, rumored to be the result of poison administered by undercover agents, was mourned not only on Chandrila, but by democratic enclaves across the galaxy. When Chandrila became the capital of the New Republic, it was not merely a political transition, but a cultural moment, a planetary vindication of its long-held belief that peace was more powerful than war. And yet, this moment came with its own tensions. The New Republic inherited a galaxy still scarred by conflict, populated by former Imperials, warlords, and disillusioned citizens who had known only strength as authority. Chandrila's proposal to dramatically demilitarize the Central Fleet was met with mixed reactions. On one hand, it was applauded as a return to ethical governance. On the other, it was criticized as dangerously naive. Critics pointed to emerging threats in the unknown regions, to pirate syndicates swelling in the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse, and to the remaining Imperial remnants consolidating under hardline commanders. But Chandrila pressed on, guided by a moral calculus that measured peace not by its fragility, but by its persistence. In this, Chandrila's ethos bore striking resemblance to that of Alderaan, another core world renowned for its pacifist stance. Like Chandrila, Alderaan maintained no standing army and prioritized education, art, and social development. But where Alderaan emphasized monarchy-led humanitarianism, Chandrila's model was grounded in communal consensus. Alderaan had Leia Organa, a warrior diplomat who believed peace must be defended by force when necessary. Chandrila had Mon Mothma, who believed peace could only survive if it never embraced violence. These differing approaches created mutual respect, but also subtle tension within the rebel alliance. After Alderaan's destruction, Chandrila mourned deeply, not only for the lives lost, but for the planetary mirror that had shattered. In Kamas, another lesser-known but deeply philosophical world, Chandrila found a quiet cousin in belief. Kamasai memory sharing and moral culture reflected Chandrila's ideals of communal responsibility and reconciliation. The Kamasai and Chandrilans often engaged in shared diplomatic initiatives, with many Kamasai exiles finding refuge in Chandrila's arcologies after the planetary bombardment that devastated their world. The two species shared a vision of a galaxy where compassion was not weakness, but wisdom incarnate. Yet despite these philosophical alliances, Chandrila never claimed universality. Its leaders understood that every world bore its own scars and history, and not every planet could afford such restraint. In times of galactic crisis, even Chandrila had to reckon with compromise. During the rise of the First Order, debates within Hana City turned fierce. The question arose, had disarmament gone too far? Had the Republic's moral purity become its blind spot? Some called for limited remilitarization, for strategic alliances with more heavily armed worlds, for security pacts that would preserve peace through strength. Others held firm to tradition, warning that every step toward militarism reopened the door that Palpatine had once kicked down. These debates were never resolved cleanly, but they were engaged with honesty, with history, and with the full weight of a world that had lived its truth for thousands of years. In the end, Chandrila's legacy of peace was not one of unbroken perfection, but of enduring effort. It demonstrated to the galaxy that power could take many forms, and that the strongest foundation for a just society was not its fleet, but its principles. It raised generations who saw diplomacy as a calling, who viewed disarmament not as disempowerment, but as an assertion of higher values. In its halls, policies were written that placed people above territory, restoration above retaliation, and dialogue above domination. In its communes, families taught children that courage meant speaking when it was dangerous to speak, and resisting not with anger but with discipline. The story of Chandrila's military and diplomatic legacy is not a story of passivity, but of purpose. It is the story of a world that dared to believe peace was possible, and proved again and again that even in the heart of darkness, the light of conviction can hold the line. It stood not with weapons, but with words, not with armies, but with ideals. And in doing so, it reminded the galaxy that the most enduring victories are those that preserve not land or power, but the soul. Chapter 8. Personalities beyond Mon Mothma, Unsung Heroes. Mon Mothma's legacy looms large in the story of Chandrila, and justifiably so. As the moral compass of the Rebel Alliance and the first Chancellor of the New Republic, her calm conviction and principled defiance helped shape the destiny of a fractured galaxy. Yet focusing solely on her brilliance obscures the quiet constellation of other Chandrilans who, in the shadows of history, carved paths every bit as vital. Beyond the Senate floor and away from the Holonets, a cadre of educators, rebels, scientists, and civic leaders toiled for generations, preserving culture, defying the empire, and nurturing the intellectual and ideological roots of resistance. These were not names emblazoned on starships or immortalized in Senate archives. They were the mentors, the innovators, the archivists, the ones whose legacies lived not in monuments, but in minds. From dusty novels, fading RPG sourcebooks, and forgotten legends footnotes, their stories resurface now, threads woven into the greater tapestry of Chandrila's unwavering commitment to peace, justice, and truth. Among these figures stands Senator Doman Barras, a name that surfaces only sporadically in the known records, yet one whose voice carried considerable weight in the tumultuous years before the formation of the Alliance to restore the Republic. A career diplomat and veteran of early Trade Commission reforms, Barras emerged as one of the few senators from the core worlds to publicly challenge the erosion of senatorial oversight under Palpatine's emergency powers. His approach differed markedly from that of Mon Mothma. Where she delivered carefully measured speeches aimed at shaping consensus, Barras favored pointed questions and rhetorical traps designed to expose contradictions in the imperial narrative. In a particularly notable session recorded in the Aldera archives, Barras interrogated Admiral Hortag regarding civilian casualties in the Chandr system, forcing the officer to admit to policies that had never been officially acknowledged. This confrontation led to Barras' censure and his eventual resignation under mounting political pressure, but he remained active in the underground. From his family estate nestled in the Wind Hollow district of Eastern Orleans, Barras coordinated quiet gatherings of dissident senators and policy experts, crafting draft charters and civilian rights codes that would later influence the framework of the Chandrila Accords. His work also helped maintain a fragile link between sympathetic factions within the Senate and those operating in exile, smoothing diplomatic tensions and keeping the idea of lawful resistance alive during the darkest years of the Empire. While Barras fought in the realm of speech and law, Arvaz Karen worked in soil and silence. An agricultural scientist who began his career refining nutrient yields in Chandrila's rotational crop terraces, Karen's contributions transcended biology and touched the core of planetary resilience. He developed the spiral root model of grain propagation, enabling staple crops to survive in shallow, rocky soils without exhausting native ecosystems. But it was his response to imperial rationing controls that turned Karen into a quiet rebel. When the Empire imposed crop quotas designed to redirect Chandrilan food surplus toward Coruscant's elite sectors, Karen initiated a planet-wide program of shadow planting, coordinating with rural communes to conceal secondary crop fields within Kelvara groves and under old irrigation arrays. These hidden harvests ensured that local populations never starved, even as official reports claimed full compliance with imperial requisitions. Later, as the rebellion gained ground, Karen's techniques were exported to refugee colonies and frontier worlds, forming the basis of the Emergency Sustenance Initiative that fed thousands during the Siege of Sullust. His efforts were practical, precise, and deeply grounded in the Chandrilan belief that dignity begins with nourishment. After the fall of the empire, Karen declined formal recognition, returning instead to teach at the Saoti Institute of Environmental Ethics, where he instructed a new generation of students not just in how to grow food, but in how to grow freedom. Even as others fought to feed or defend, one Chandrilan worked tirelessly to remember. Vex Corden, a quiet man with sharp features and a voice barely louder than a whisper, served as the chief cultural archivist at the Hana City Public Forum Repository during the early imperial era. At a time when entire histories were being erased or rewritten to serve the new order, Corden undertook a project of defiant preservation. Under the guise of standard deaccessioning procedures, ostensibly clearing outdated materials from the civic record, he secretly duplicated thousands of pre-imperial documents, artwork descriptions, oral histories, and multimedia exhibits. These included first-hand accounts of Republic Senate sessions, pre-clone war education protocols, and rare recordings of Jedi diplomacy efforts. Corden stored these records within a series of hidden databanks he embedded within Chandrilan sculpture foundations, coded to respond only to a specific sequence of philosophical prompts. These repositories, later dubbed the Living Memory Stones, would not be discovered until after the Battle of Endor, when rebel archivists retrieved them during the establishment of the New Republic Cultural Restoration Program. Corden's foresight preserved aspects of the Republic's civic soul that might have otherwise been lost forever. And though his work was nearly invisible in his lifetime, those who knew him spoke of a man who saw memory not as history, but as resistance. He died mere months before the Empire's collapse, never witnessing the return of truth, but ensuring it would come. Other figures, too, deserve recognition, names less known but no less essential. Ella Vizara, a choreographer from the Miran Commune, used traditional Chandrilan interpretive dance to encode rebel communication patterns, training dozens of operatives in gesture-based signal relays. Her performances were held in open-air amphitheaters, with subtle deviations in footwork or hand movement indicating coded messages about rendezvous points or supply drops. Den Sari, a transportation official in Port Adjan, ran a covert operation in which shipping manifests were forged to redirect medical supplies and parts from Imperial-controlled depots to rebel-aligned refugee ships. His ledger codes, written in archaic Chandrilan numeric dialect, baffled even high-level slicers when first decrypted. Drina Fail, a professor of literature, composed allegorical holonovels that examine the psychological toll of life under the Empire. Though widely distributed under the radar, these works became crucial tools for counseling traumatized populations during the war's final years, offering readers a means to process grief and reclaim narrative agency. Even within the academic sphere, Chandrila produced figures who, though not openly political, laid the intellectual groundwork for the rebellion's ethical direction. Professor Ren Nekari, for instance, taught comparative governance at the Saoti Institute. His lectures on the difference between lawful compliance and moral responsibility were circulated via underground holodisks and became required viewing in many alliance cells. His most cited work, Governance as Consent, argued that institutions derive legitimacy not from force or tradition, but from a continuous, participatory relationship with the governed, a notion that would shape new Republic deliberations on planetary self-determination and Senate decentralization. Nekari's theories, though purely academic at first glance, directly influenced Mon Mothma's policy architecture, particularly in the establishment of rotational capital mandates and civilian oversight boards within the New Republic. All of these figures, Barras, Karen, Corden, and the many others whose names rarely appear in Senate logs or campaign hullareels, form a chorus of quiet revolutionaries. They exemplified a Chandrilan truth deeper than policy or proclamation, that resistance is not a singular act, but a lifetime of small, deliberate choices. It is choosing to teach the truth when the curriculum is a lie. It is planting food not for profit, but for dignity. It is building a sculpture that speaks in silence, or writing a dance that moves both body and message. It is hiding memory in stone, and feeding freedom with the harvest of a hidden field. It is speaking when you are expected to stay silent, and staying when it would be easier to flee. Their stories remind us that while Chandrila may be known in galactic memory as the world of Mon Mothma, it was never the work of one woman alone. It was a culture, a people, a philosophy carried in the hearts and hands of thousands. While Mothma stood before the Senate and declared her defiance, these others ensured that her words had a foundation. They built the soil in which rebellion could grow, not a rebellion of destruction, but one of reclamation. They ensured that when the new republic rose, it rose not only with laws, but with stories, not only with structures, but with roots. And so, in the quiet corners of Chandrila, their legacies endure. In the terraces of the Miran Amphitheater, where students still study the dances of Ella Vizara. In the fields near Nima Plain, where farmers teach the spiral root method and speak the name of Arviz Karen with reverence. In the archives of the New Republic, where Vex Corden's memory stones line a gallery lit by filtered starlight. In classrooms where Ren Nekari's words are recited not as relics, but as challenges. They are the unsung heroes, and in a galaxy too often captivated by blasters and battles, their legacy reminds us that the quiet work, the slow, deliberate shaping of minds and hearts, is what truly changes the course of history. Chapter 9, Shadows of the First Order, Chandrila under threat. The fires of war never remain extinguished for long in the galaxy, and as the embers of the Empire gave way to the flickering hopes of the New Republic, the shadows began to stir again. Chandrila, once the serene cradle of galactic reconstruction and the first capital of the new democratic order, found itself confronted not with open invasion or planetary bombardment, but with something more insidious, the slow, methodical return of authoritarianism masked in new banners and old methods. The First Order did not sweep through Chandrila with fleets in formation. Instead, it whispered through bureaucratic corridors, slipped into civil discourse, and unraveled the Republic's institutions from the inside. The legacy Chandrila had built, of peace, of conscience, of law by consent, was tested once more, this time not by sheer force, but by the strategic corrosion of everything it stood for. The initial incursions were almost invisible, cloaked in administrative confusion and distant unrest. Officially, the First Order was a remnant, a peripheral menace relegated to distant sectors of the unknown regions, a subject of concern but not alarm. Yet on Chandrila, those who studied history and listened closely to the patterns of war began to sense something far more ominous. Civic analysts and former intelligence operatives, many trained in the ethics and methods of Chandrilan non-lethal resistance, observed a subtle shift in New Republic channels. Communication delays, inexplicable redactions in Senate correspondence, the sudden reassignment of senators sympathetic to increased defense funding. All the signs were there, of infiltration, of manipulation, of sabotage by unseen hands. But when raised in Senate forums, these concerns were dismissed as paranoia. The Republic, now headquartered on the ecumenopolis of Hosnian Prime, had begun to drift from its Chandrilan foundations. Pacifism was no longer fashionable in the face of resurgent militarist doctrine. The decision to relocate the Senate from Chandrila to Hosnian Prime was framed as practical. A rotating capital, it was argued, would prevent the centralization of power and embody the Republic's egalitarian vision. Yet to many Chandrilans, it felt like a slow abandonment. The great Senate Dome of Harmony, designed to evoke the transparency and equilibrium of their political ideals, fell into ceremonial disuse. The institutions that had shaped the early Republic's policy, its peacekeeping councils, cultural restoration initiatives, and planetary ethics forums, were gradually defunded or absorbed into larger, more impersonal bureaucratic engines. And within the silence that followed, new voices began to rise. Voices that questioned the efficacy of disarmament. Voices that whispered of a galaxy needing strong hands. Voices that, in coded language, began to undermine Chandrila's legacy as impractical. Idealistic, outdated. It was in this atmosphere of quiet dismissal that the First Order struck its first blows, not with fleets, but with data. Chandrilan systems, once considered among the most secure in the Republic, suffered a series of cascading security breaches. Classified sensor data was leaked. Emergency response networks were paralyzed during critical drills. Disinformation campaigns took root on education networks, spreading false histories and sowing distrust between communes. Where once the youth of Chandrila had been taught to debate with reason and empathy, now they encountered viral feeds that glorified strength and caricatured pacifism as cowardice. In some cases, student forums were co-opted by external agitators posing as cultural critics, guiding conversations subtly toward first-order talking points. These were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated, precise, and devastating. The civic body of Chandrila, so long protected by its belief in openness, found itself under siege from within. As sabotage campaigns intensified, Chandrila's famed local resistance networks, Descendants of the peacekeeper guilds and the rebel cells that had once helped topple the empire attempted to respond, but they had grown complacent in the years of peace. Their communications protocols, once state-of-the-art, had not been updated to counter new forms of biometric interception. Their leadership, aging and fragmented, struggled to adapt to the fluidity of asymmetric digital warfare. In a series of quiet raids never publicized in official channels, multiple key coordinators of these networks were arrested, disappeared, or neutralized. Files vanished. Meeting places were compromised. The resistance, once a whispering flame, began to flicker in earnest. Entire communes that had once held emergency preparedness drills under the pretense of cultural festivals now abandoned the practice out of fear of drawing unwanted attention. In the space of a single standard year, Chandrila's defensive infrastructure, never military but deeply civic, had been eroded to the point of paralysis. The betrayal hit hardest among those who had come of age during the empire's fall. To them, the return of fear felt like an old wound reopened. Civic forums that once echoed with spirited disagreement now fell silent, participants wary of being overheard. Artistic institutions known for symbolism and quiet protest were shuttered after a series of safety violations. Schools were forced to adopt revised curricula issued by the Central Senate offices, which emphasized loyalty to the new republic above critical thinking or cultural introspection. Surveillance gliders, once used to monitor weather patterns, were quietly reprogrammed with new behavioral pattern recognition software. In some cases, entire communes were subjected to nighttime flyovers, lights extinguished as families huddled indoors, unsure if the age of openness had finally ended. Yet even in these shadows, Chandrila did not entirely surrender. The roots of its defiance ran too deep, too interwoven with daily life to be fully cut away. Survivor accounts from this period, many recorded in secrecy and later transmitted through secure channels to sympathetic historians in the Mid-Rim, tell of quiet courage. A commune in the Virajansi highlands began distributing banned books encoded as agricultural manuals. One contained the full unredacted version of Bale Antilles' speeches, its pages formatted to resemble irrigation plans. A retired professor from the Saoti Institute secretly broadcast readings of the Chandrila Charter, using an old astronomical frequency, long considered obsolete. He spoke into the void each night, unsure if anyone still listened. In the underground tunnels, once used to shelter rebel meetings, children drew murals of Mon Mothma, of the Dome of Harmony, of lights rising from Kelvara fields, symbols of what had been and what they still hoped could be again. The internal debates that once defined Chandrila's culture persisted in new forms. Some believed the planet must once again embrace resistance, even armed if necessary, that diplomacy had failed and ideals could no longer be preserved without protection. Others clung to the old ways, insisting that becoming like the enemy was the surest path to defeat. Between them stood a growing youth movement, unaffiliated, leaderless, but determined. They called themselves the Quiet Flame, drawing on the teachings of Talakai Selu and the encoded philosophies of Vex Corden. They used poetry, digital collage, and encoded performance art to protest first-order interference. Their works appeared on public screens without warning, then vanished just as quickly. A 3-second visual loop of the Mirror Bay glinting beneath twin moons, accompanied by a single line, "The Republic is a promise we keep," was seen by thousands before the signal was traced and terminated. No arrests were made, but a curfew was imposed. The youth simply adapted, shifting to new mediums, new frequencies, new acts of defiance. They were artists, coders, farmers' children, teachers' apprentices. They carried no blasters, but they carried memory. And in memory, they carried rebellion. Chandrila's status as a symbol of new republic ideals made it a target not just militarily, but philosophically. The First Order did not need to destroy the planet, it needed to discredit it, to show that pacifism failed, that democracy could not defend itself, that liberty was a luxury too delicate for a dangerous galaxy. In that context, every protest, every whispered story, every coded broadcast from a remote farm became a blow against that narrative. The First Order feared Chandrila not because of its strength, but because of what it represented, a different way of being. A world that had built its identity not on domination, but on restraint. A people who had proven, time and again, that hope could survive without conquest. The Order wanted Chandrila to forget itself, to turn away from its traditions, to succumb to the same cynicism that corrupted the old republic. It wanted to erase the memory of what Chandrila had once inspired. But memory is resilient. The same bioluminescent moss that decorated the arches of Hana City glowed still in the tunnels beneath it, now illuminating hidden gatherings. The wind still moved through Kelvara fields, carrying the echoes of old songs. Lanterns still rose into the sky on festival nights, though now in secret, each one a silent defiance. Chandrila may have lost its title as capital, its open forums, and many of its defenders, but it had not lost its soul. In that final twilight before the Hosnian cataclysm, when the First Order's true hand was revealed with the annihilation of the Senate, those who survived on Chandrila did so not by strength of arms, but by strength of purpose. And in the years that followed, when the resistance rose from the ashes and the galaxy turned its gaze once more toward freedom, it found Chandrila waiting, bruised but unbroken, quiet but aflame. The shadows had come, but they had not stayed, and the planet that had once dared to believe in peace dared still. Even under threat, even under silence, it remembered, and in remembering it endured. Chapter 10: Enduring Flame, Legacy and Future of Chandrila. In the age beyond Skywalkers and Star Destroyers, when the blinding turbulence of galactic war has dimmed into the steady hum of reconstruction, Chandrila endures, not merely as a world, but as a philosophy. It is easy, in the aftermath of so much devastation, to look for power in the obvious places, in fleets rebuilt, in armories restocked, in bold proclamations from rising governments scrambling to fill the void left by the shattered remnants of the Empire and the brief, brilliant flicker of the New Republic. But amid all this noise and urgency, Chandrila remains a stillness at the center, a quiet, unwavering presence that continues to offer not might but meaning. In the post-Skywalker era, Chandrila has reasserted itself not as a capital of governance, but as a capital of conscience, a cultural lodestar that draws thinkers, diplomats, and seekers from across the stars to study its legacy and to imagine anew what civilization can and should be. Modern-day Chandrila has emerged from the trials of the First Order era with its character intact and its institutions strengthened by adversity. The scars remain, of course, both literal and symbolic. Certain communes remain abandoned, their populations having fled during the darkest days of surveillance and disruption. In Hana City, the Senate Dome still bears the faded outlines of security expansion structures hastily added during the First Order's infiltration. But these remnants are not hidden or denied. They are preserved as part of Chandrila's living civic memory, integrated into educational curricula and public spaces as constant reminders of the vigilance required to maintain liberty. There are no monuments to war heroes on Chandrila, only archives of debate, sanctuaries of speech, and gardens of remembrance where citizens reflect on the cost of fear and the price of silence. It is a world that has learned, through painful repetition, that history must be both remembered and questioned, and that progress is the act of continuing to ask the right questions even when the answers grow uncomfortable. As other worlds rebuild their economies through mineral exploitation or military contracting, Chandrila has doubled down on what it has always done best: cultivating knowledge, nurturing diplomacy, and facilitating interstellar cooperation. Its universities, reinvigorated by a new generation of scholars raised amid ideological conflict, now serve as epicenters for galactic ethics and planetary governance. The Saoti Institute has expanded its curriculum to include courses on interspecies mediation, truth repair policy, and post-authoritarian civic restoration, often welcoming students from systems recently liberated or still recovering from internal strife. The Chandrila Institute of Democratic Studies offers immersive programs in decolonial law, memory culture, and dissent theory, attended not only by aspiring senators, but by droid rights activists, climate reform advocates, and even former insurgents seeking new paths toward reconciliation. The children of exiles and warlords sit beside the grandchildren of Chandrila's pacifists, debating not how to win the next war, but how to prevent it entirely. Diplomatically, Chandrila has become the Republic's unofficial neutral ground. Though no longer the capital, it is where treaties are drafted before they are ratified, where new systems petition for recognition, and where disputes between member worlds are mediated with quiet precision in the gardens of Mirror Bay or within the acoustically tuned chambers of the old Forum Hall. These discussions are facilitated not by career politicians, but by civilian panels trained in restorative dialogue and drawn from across social strata. Chandrila has institutionalized humility into its diplomatic process. No voice is dismissed for lack of rank, and no decision is made without collective context. It is a method that requires patience, but it yields decisions that last. In a galaxy so often governed by impulse and crisis, Chandrila offers something else entirely: a deliberative calm, an ethical pause before action. Culturally, the planet has embraced its new role as a sanctuary for those seeking respite from the accelerating chaos of hyperspace commerce and core world competition. Tourism, once a marginal part of Chandrila's economy, has grown, though carefully managed, in line with ecological and communal values. Visitors arrive not for spectacle, but for immersion. They walk the Kelvara fields at dawn, attend lantern vigils under the twin moons, and participate in public forums on ethics, memory, and environmental stewardship. Pilgrimages are made to the living memory stones, where fragments of pre-imperial history encoded by Vex Corden are now open to the galaxy, and to the restored gardens of Talakai Selu, where guided meditations on non-reactive guardianship are led by his ideological descendants. Holodocumentarians, artists, and historians come not to capture a moment, but to experience a mindset. Chandrila exports not only philosophy, but atmosphere, a cultural gravity that gently pulls visitors inward toward reflection and balance. Its agricultural sector remains vital, though no longer solely for sustenance. Chandrila's farms now serve as laboratories for sustainable terraforming techniques, researched in collaboration with Outer Rim colonists seeking to rehabilitate war-torn worlds. The spiral root grain methods of Arvis Karen have been refined and disseminated across refugee colonies, while native Chandrilan pollinator ecology has inspired droid-assisted agricultural systems compatible with fragile ecosystems. The planet's exports are less about volume than example, blueprints for decentralized, climate-resilient food production rather than mass shipments. This slow, purposeful growth mirrors Chandrila's broader cultural ethos: nourishment over novelty, sustainability over spectacle. Perhaps most profound is Chandrila's influence on the new generation of galactic leadership. While its political parties remain small and localized, its graduates and ideological adherents now populate senates, courts, and administrative bodies across multiple systems. They carry with them a distinctly Chandrilan sensibility, one that values civil service over ambition, dialogue over decree. This influence is subtle but growing. In recent sessions of the restored Galactic Council, several proposed amendments to interspecies refugee law bore unmistakable traces of Saoti ethics lectures. A proposal to establish a permanent civic conscience bureau, tasked with independently reviewing Republic legislation for ethical coherence, was first drafted at the Institute of Democratic Studies. And in a widely circulated address to the Galactic Medical Forum, the young senator from Shirley openly credited her Chandrilan education with shaping her views on trauma-centered policymaking. There are, of course, detractors. Some argue that Chandrila's ideals are impractical in an age still riddled with remnants of conflict, that its insistence on disarmament and dialogue places it out of touch with the reality of modern threats. They point to the rise of new regional powers, to the growing assertiveness of Outer Rim coalitions, to the persistent black markets that thrive in the vacuum of centralized enforcement. But to Chandrila, these critiques are not rejections, they are reminders. Reminders that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the active shaping of conditions in which justice can thrive. The Chandrilan response has never been to retreat into isolationism, but to refine its methods, to listen, to adapt. It invests in cultural education, supports planetary autonomy movements, and develops tools for civic self-defense that resist militarization while preserving community agency. It remains engaged not by overpowering others, but by anchoring itself so firmly in its values that it becomes difficult for others to ignore. At the heart of Chandrila's legacy lies a simple but profound philosophical assertion: that freedom is not merely the space to act, but the capacity to choose well, and that conscience is the compass that makes such choice meaningful. This belief, repeated in countless forums, etched into the arches of amphitheaters, and whispered through generations, forms the enduring flame of Chandrila's identity. It is what the planet teaches, not through mandates or proclamations, but through its very existence: that a society can be both vulnerable and strong, that memory is as powerful a weapon as any fleet, that kindness, when practiced collectively, becomes policy, that peace, once truly chosen, becomes not a goal, but a way of life. In the face of a galaxy that continues to tilt toward the seductive gravity of control, Chandrila offers a counterweight: a model of slow, deliberate civilization that chooses to remember even when forgetting might be easier, that chooses dialogue even when anger demands retribution, that chooses hope not because it is simple, but because it is necessary. Its future will not be marked by great wars or legendary battles. There will be no Chandrilan superweapons, no grand armadas bearing its name. But in every system where a student is taught to think freely, where a refugee is welcomed with dignity, where a policy is drafted with the full knowledge of what came before, there Chandrila will be present. Not as ruler, not as power, but as conscience. And so the flame endures. It burns not in towers, but in classrooms, in gardens, in gatherings under moonlight. It is carried by those who believe that the best kind of power is the one that invites others to share it. It survives in the quiet defiance of every citizen who chooses to remember. It is a light not of conquest, but of clarity. And as long as it remains, the galaxy will always have a place to turn when it forgets itself. A place not of legends, but of lessons. A place called Chandrila.